The sound a hand makes across a woman's face in a ballroom is nothing like the movies. It isn't a crack. It's flatter than that, wetter, more ordinary. The sound of a wet dish towel dropped on a countertop, and the terrible part is how quickly it's over. 1 second of noise, and then a silence so complete that I could hear the ice settling in a bucket 40 feet away. My name is Delia Marsh. I'm 36 years old, and for 11 years I was married to Beckett Ashford, 41, Chief Operating Officer of Ashford & Sons Development, the family firm that put up half the glass boxes along Boston's waterfront. On the night of our 10th anniversary gala, in the grand ballroom of a harbor hotel his father practically owned, in front of 600 enough, that I went down through a table of champagne flutes. I went down through a table of champagne flutes. Some of them laughed. Not all of them. I want to be precise about that, because I've replayed it enough times to be precise. The table nearest the dais, his golf people, his lender people, a city councillor whose real section sterling had funded twice. Those men laughed the way men laugh when they need permission for something. A woman in green stood halfway up, and her husband put a hand on her forearm, and she sat back down and looked at her plate. A kid working the coat check had his phone up, and a banquet captain named Rosa Guerrero, 52 years old, who had checked on my water glass 3 times that night, because she'd noticed I hadn't touched my food, came across that floor in flat black shoes and knelt in the glass, and put her hand under my elbow and said, quietly, in my ear, Misha, don't get up until you can stand. I have thought about Rosa more than I've thought about any of the 600. Here's what nobody in that room knew, including my husband of 11 years. My father is Von Callahan. He's 69. He runs a private credit fund out of a brick building on Federal Street with no sign on the door. And the reason none of the Ashfords ever put that together is that Marsh was my mother's name. And I took it back when I was 19, the year she moved us out of his house and into a 2-bedroom in Quincy with a radiator that banged all winter. My parents' marriage ended badly, not violently. My father has never hit anyone in his life, which is part of why what happened later mattered so much to him. But badly. He was building something, and he built it instead of coming home. My mother, Josephine Marsh, taught 4th grade for 31 years and told me once, folding laundry, that she'd rather be poor and looked at than rich and passed by. I was 17, and I thought that was the wisest thing anyone had ever said. I stopped taking his calls for 3 years. I took her name. When she died of pancreatic cancer the spring I was 24, my father came to the funeral and stood in the back and left before the reception, and afterward I found an envelope in my coat pocket that I didn't open for 4 days. We fixed it, slowly, in the way of people who are both stubborn and both sorry. Sunday breakfasts. Then Sunday dinners. By the time I met Beckett, I had a father again. But I had also spent 5 years being courted by a certain kind of Boston man who found out what my father did and suddenly wanted to know if I'd ever thought about hosting a dinner party. So when I met Beckett Ashford at a fundraiser for a music education nonprofit, and he asked what I did, and I said structural engineer, and he said, God, an actual job, and didn't ask me about my family for 3 months. I let it stay that way. Then it was 6 months, then it was too late to bring up without it seeming like a lie, which of course by then it was. And I want to say something about that, because I know how it sounds. How do you marry a man for 11 years and he never meets your father? Believe me, I've asked myself. But here's the thing, the Ashfords never asked either. Not once. Camille Ashford, 66, my mother-in-law, told me at our engagement brunch that she thought it was marvelous that I came unencumbered. That was the word. Unencumbered. No father to negotiate, no brothers, no mother with opinions about the seating chart. It made me manageable. It made me a girl who'd landed in a soft life and would be grateful. We were married at the town hall in Nantucket with 4 people present, because Camille wanted a spring wedding at the club, and I wanted my mother's ring on my finger, and no one to ask why the bride's side was empty. My father sent a case of wine to the house and did not come, at my request. I've apologized to him for that, he said, You don't owe me an apology, you owe me a Sunday. For 11 years, my life looked like this. Beckett was charming in public and correcting in private. It started small enough that you could mistake it for taste. The way I laughed was loud. The way I ate bread. I quit engineering 4 years in, not because he told me to, but because he'd say things like the girls all wonder how you do it in a tone that meant nobody was wondering. I took over the Ashford Family Foundation instead, which sounded like a promotion and was actually a hobby with letterhead. We funded music programs in Dorchester schools. That part I loved. That part was real. Sterling Ashford, 71, my father-in-law, called me sweetheart for a decade and never once used my name. At Thanksgiving, he'd point at me with a knife and tell the table that Beckett had married a woman who could read a blueprint, which was more than he could say for his own wife. And Camille would laugh, and Tessa would laugh. Tessa Ashford Doyle, 38, my sister-in-law, VP of Marketing, at a firm where her only qualification was her last name. Tessa gave me a book about fertility for Christmas in front of 11 people. Tessa asked, at a dinner party, whether teachers' salaries were even taxable. And I took it. 11 years of taking it because my mother had taught me that a person's cruelty is usually a symptom, and because I loved my husband, and because at 2 a.m. when I couldn't sleep, he'd put his hand flat on my back and breathe until I matched him. And you cannot explain that to anyone who wasn't there. The first crack didn't come from him. It came from a bank statement in March. I have my own money, not Ashford money, my mother's. Her life insurance and the sale of the Quincy condo came to $340,000, and it sat in an account at a credit union in Braintree that I'd opened when I was in college, and I'd never touched it because touching it would have meant she was really gone. Separate property. Named in the prenup. In a clause I signed at 25 without reading. In a conference room where nobody offered me water. In March, the balance was $11,000. I want you to understand that I did not confront anybody. I sat on the closed lid of the toilet in our bathroom in Wellesley, with my phone in both hands and my ears ringing, and I did the thing that 11 years of being told I was hysterical had trained me to do first. I assumed I was wrong. I logged out. I logged back in. I scrolled up. 3 wires over 14 months, all to an entity called Ashford Legacy Holdings LLC, all authorized by a signature card I'd signed in a stack of refinance paperwork on our kitchen island while a contractor waited in the driveway. And here is the answer to a question I know people will ask because I asked it of myself for weeks afterward, in the mirror, like a woman interrogating a stranger. How do you not notice $300,000? Because I never looked. Because the whole architecture of that marriage was built so that I would never look. Because the bills came to him, the accountant reported to him, and the one account that was mine I treated like a grave. You don't visit a grave to check the balance. I didn't say a word. That's the only thing I did right that spring. Instead, I started copying things. Foundation, ledgers, because I ran the foundation and had every right to them. And what I found in the foundation's books, so the next 6 weeks, at night with a glass of wine going warm beside my laptop, was $1.2 million in program-related investments made to a shell that shared a registered agent with Ashford Legacy Holdings. Money that was supposed to buy second-hand Kalos for kids in Dorchester had overpaid for, that Beckett had overpaid for in 2023 and could not unload. By April, I had a lawyer, Adele Ruiz, 47, whose office in downtown Crossing had a dead fern in the window, and a client list you would not believe. By May, I had a forensic accountant. By June, I had a folder. And I had one more thing which I did not want. Brooke Lindstrom, 27, Beckett's executive assistant. I'd met her at 3 Christmas parties. She'd complimented my earrings. In late May, our housekeeper mentioned, casually, apologetically, that she'd found a second flat iron in the guest bath, and I said thank you and went and stood in the guest bath for a long time. In the closet of the pool house, I found a garment bag, 2 dresses, size 2, and a pair of white leather sneakers, and a phone charger plugged in behind the nightstand. I photographed all of it. I did not move any of it. I closed the door. You want to know what I felt? I'll tell you the truth. Relief. That's the shameful part. Relief, because for 14 months I'd been walking around thinking something is wrong with me. I'm imagining things, I'm losing it, and here it was, folded neatly, size 2. Adele told me to wait. She said the anniversary gala was in 6 weeks, that Sterling was refinancing the firm's credit facility in August, and that timing is not a small thing in Massachusetts, and that if I filed in June, Beckett would move what was left, and I'd spend 3 years and $200,000 chasing it. So I said yes to the gala. I let Camille pick a caterer. I stood for a dress fitting. I smiled in a photograph for the invitation. I planned a party to celebrate a decade with a man I already knew I was going to destroy. And I want to be honest with you, I did not feel powerful. I felt like a woman lying down in a river, letting it take her somewhere she couldn't see. The gala was the second Saturday in September. 600 people, Harbor View. An ice sculpture of the firm's logo, that length, as understated. Beckett was stained. Beckett was radiant that night. He was so good at nights like that. He put his hand on the small of my back and steered me through the room and told a lender's wife that I was the smartest person in his house. And I stood there in a navy dress and felt the last small, stupid flare of hope, the one that says maybe I'm wrong about all of it. The toasts started at 9. Sterling went first, because Sterling always went first. He talked about legacy for a while. He talked about his father, who'd poured concrete. He talked about Beckett, who had, in Sterling's telling, single-handedly saved the firm during the pandemic, a firm that had in fact been saved by a federal loan and a refinancing my father's fund had quietly participated in, though I did not know that yet. And then he turned to me and he raised his glass and he said, "And to Delia, who came to us with nothing but a pretty face and a public school education, and who has spent 10 years learning. God love her, she's still learning, that this family runs on more than good intentions." 600 people laughed. It was a warm laugh. That's what I remember. It was affectionate, the way you laugh at a golden retriever. Then he said, into the microphone, "Sweetheart, I've said it before, a woman is either an asset or an expense." And Camille tilted her head and smiled at me, and Tessa said something to her husband Miles behind her hand, and something in me that'd been holding a very heavy door shut for 11 years just let go of the handle. I took the microphone out of Sterling's hand, gently. I even said, "May I?" I said, "Thank you, Sterling. Since we're talking about assets, nobody in this room has ever asked me what I did before I married your son. I designed the load path for the atrium you're all standing under. I was 24. I ran the numbers on that roof 3 times, because I was the only woman on the crew, and I knew whose fault it would be if it came down. Someone actually cheered, a woman in the back. God bless her, wherever she is. And then, because I was shaking, and because the door was open now, I said, and for the record, the foundation is short $1.2 million. And I'd love to talk about which column that goes in. I watched Beckett's face change. It changed in a way I had never seen in 11 years. And I understood, in the half-second I had to understand it, that I had never actually met him. He crossed the dais in 3 steps and hit me open-handed. Hard, high on the cheekbone, and my heel went out from under me, and I went backward into the table with the flutes. I remember glass. I remember the cold of the champagne going through the navy dress. I remember the ballroom sound system carrying the microphone's fall. A hollow boom that went through the whole room, louder than the slap. I remember lying there thinking, absurdly, "Don't cry, they'll say you were emotional." The golf table laughed. The kid at the coat check filmed. The woman in green tried to stand. Rosa Guerrero knelt in the glass in her uniform and put her hand under my elbow and told me not to get up until I could stand. And when I finally did, she walked me out through the service corridor past the dish pit, past a line of cooks who all stopped and looked at their shoes, and she sat me on an overturned milk crate by the loading dock and gave me a bag of ice wrapped in a bar towel and said, You want me to call the police? Or do you want to call somebody first? Nobody had ever asked me that in that order before. I said, both. I called 911 from the loading dock. Then, while the ice went slack against my face, and I could hear a string quartet still playing 4 floors up, I called my father. He picked up on the second ring, because he's 69 and he sleeps like a man with a conscience. I said, Dad. And then I couldn't say anything else for maybe 8 seconds. And he didn't say anything either, he just breathed. And then I said, Dad, please come. Here's the part I'd want to know if I were you. He did not come charging into that ballroom. He didn't burst through the doors and level anybody. This is real life. My father was in Wellesley in a bathrobe, 40 minutes away in Saturday night Boston traffic, and by the time his car reached that loading dock, I had already given a statement to 2 Boston PD officers, and one of them, a woman about my age, had photographed my face under the sodium light and asked if I needed a ride to Mass General, and I'd said no, and she'd said, Ma'am, go anyway, get it documented. Trust me. I went anyway. The intake nurse wrote "struck by spouse" on a form, and the words looked like they belonged to someone else. Zygomatic contusion, no fracture. Photographs, front and profile, with a ruler held up beside my cheek. My father sat in a molded plastic chair in that hallway from 11:40 p.m. until almost 4 in the morning and said maybe 9 words the entire time. When they discharged me, he stood up and put his suit jacket over my shoulders. He'd dressed at some point on the way, and outside on Fruit Street he stopped walking and said, Delia, do you want me to fix this or do you want to fix this? And I said, I want to fix this. I want you to open the door. He nodded. Once, he'd waited 12 years for me to ask him as for anything. We did not go back to the house that night. Adele had told me months earlier, if it ever gets physical, do not go back to the house alone and do not go back for your things. On Sunday morning, a Wellesley officer escorted me to the door for a civil standby, which is a thing I did not know existed until I needed it. My clothes were already in contractor bags in the mudroom. 3 of them, black, tied off. People ask about this. I've been asked about it since. How did he pack your things that fast when he was at a party? He didn't. That's the answer. Beckett was at the Four Seasons that night with his father's lawyer. Those bags had been packed the previous Thursday. I know because the housekeeper, Marisol, told the detective, and because the bags were sitting on top of a stack of moving boxes labeled in Brooke Lindstrom's handwriting, and because the divorce complaint Beckett filed in Norfolk County on Monday morning had been drafted, per the metadata, on the 18th of August. He hadn't lost his temper at that gala. He'd lost his patience. There's a difference, and the difference is everything. Safing, he'd been planning to move me out with the trash bags and a check and the prenup quietly in October after the refinance closed. What I said into that microphone told him I'd found the foundation money, and the animal in him decided, in front of 600 witnesses and 100 iPhones, that the fastest way to shut a woman up is to knock her down. It was, without question, the most expensive decision of his life. Suffolk County charged him with assault and battery on a family or household member. Massachusetts is not a state where you make that go away with a firm's letterhead, and it is definitely not a state where you make it go away when a coat check kid named Anthony has 41 seconds of 4K footage and a videographer Camille hired has 3 angles. I took a 209A order, an abuse prevention order ex parte first, then extended after a hearing where Beckett wore a gray suit and looked at me the whole time with an expression of wounded confusion so convincing that I understood, finally, that he believed it. That's what I couldn't get over. He wasn't performing for the judge. Somewhere in the machinery of that man, he genuinely felt that I had done this to him. The criminal case took 11 months. But the criminal case was never going to be the reckoning. A conviction gives you a piece of paper. It doesn't give you back 11 years. Understand what my father actually is, because it took me most of my adult life to understand it. Von Callahan does not own buildings. He owns the money the buildings are built with. Callahan Partners is a private credit fund, mezzanine debt, bridge loans, the kind of money you take when the bank says no and you need to close in 12 days. 60% of the men who laughed at that gala had at some point needed money in 12 days. Ashford and Sons had a $40 million revolving credit facility with a regional bank, and stapled to it, in the second lien position, was a $9 million mezzanine note taken out in 2021 to survive the shutdown. Sterling had personally guaranteed that note. He'd signed it in a hurry, in April of a very bad year, and he'd never met the counterparty. Because the counterparty was a Delaware entity, and the entity's manager was a man named Harlan Voss, 58, who is general counsel at Callahan Partners, and who has never once had his picture in the Globe. My father had underwritten the Ashfords in 2021 without telling me. I found this out at 4:30 in the morning outside Mass General, and I laughed so hard I frightened him. But that's not the twist, and I don't want to be one of those people who tells you her father saved her. Here's the twist. In 2023, for reasons involving estate taxes and a cardiologist, and a man's realization that he is not going to live forever, my father moved the voting interests in 3 of his funds into an irrevocable trust. The beneficiary of that trust, the sole beneficiary, with sole voting authority over the trust's holdings after her 35th birthday, is me. I turned 35 in February 2025, 8 months before the gala. Beckett gave me a spa gift card and Tessa gave me a candle, and I signed a document in Harlan Voss's office at 11 a.m. and was home by 2 and made a chicken. I owned my husband's family's debt. I had owned it for 8 months. Nobody in that ballroom knew, including me, really. I'd filed it away as an abstraction, a tax thing. My father's paperwork. Then Beckett hit me, and the abstraction stood up and put on shoes. The mezzanine note had a covenant. It's called a material adverse change clause, and it's boilerplate, and everybody signs it and nobody reads it. And what it says in plain English is, if something happens that materially damages the borrower's business, the lender can call the loan. $9 million due in full, on demand. Adele and Harlan and a forbearance specialist named Priya sat in a conference room with me for 6 hours on a Tuesday and walked through it. Was a viral video of the COO of a family real estate firm assaulting his wife at the firm's own gala, a material adverse change. 2 lenders had already pulled out of the August refinance. The city councilor who'd laughed had returned Sterling's donation. A hospital system had suspended a $50 million build. Priya looked up from her legal pad and said the driest sentence I have ever heard in my life. She said, "In my professional opinion, this is what the clause is for." There was another clause, too. Sterling's personal guarantee, the house on Beacon Hill, the compound on the vineyard, the boat. He'd pledged all of it in 2021 to keep his father's name on a building, and he'd forgotten, the way rich men forget, that a promise is a promise even when you make it to a stranger. I had the fraud, too. The $1.2 million out of a 501c3, which is not a marital squabble. It's a matter for the Attorney General's nonprofit organizations division, and I sent it there, with the ledgers, on a Thursday. And I had the prenup, which turned out to be the funniest part. That prenup protected Ashford assets from me, and my separate property from them. Beckett had wired my mother's $340,000 into Ashford Legacy Holdings. He'd broken his own shield. Adele explained it to me like this. He picked up the gun by the barrel. We called the note on the 14th of November. I did not have to be in the room. Harlan told me twice that I did not have to be in the room. Said, gently, that some of her clients found these meetings less satisfying than they expected, and that satisfaction was not, strictly speaking, a legal remedy. I went anyway, not for revenge. I want to be clear about this, and I've had a year to be sure. I went because for 11 years I had sat at tables where men decided things about my life while I passed the rolls, and I was done being told about it afterward. The conference room was on the 11th floor of the Ashford building, the one with the atrium I'd designed the load path for, when I was 24. Sterling came in first. Camille came, which is not normal, and I understood why the moment I saw her hands. Tessa came. Beckett came last, and he had a bruise of his own, a black eye, courtesy, I later learned, of a man in a parking garage in Southie whose sister had seen the video. Life is not always subtle. They had been told they were meeting the fund's principals about a forbearance. Harlan and I walked in together, and I sat down in the middle of the long side of the table, and Sterling looked at Harlan and said, "This is a private meeting." And Harlan Voss, who is 60 inches of grim New England lawyer, and who has known me since I was 11, said, "It is, Mr. Ashford, she's the reason it's private." I put the folder on the table. I didn't open it right away. I said, "Sterling, $9,400,000, principal and accrued. Due today. We're calling the note under Section 8.3. He actually smiled. He was still, in that moment, the man who called me sweetheart. He said, "Honey, I have no idea what you think you're holding." So I opened the folder and I read him the first page. His signature, April 2021, on a personal guarantee. Then Harlan slid the trust certificate across the table, and Sterling picked it up, and I watched his eyes move down to the beneficiary line and stop. He said, "Callahan." He said it the way you'd say a diagnosis. And Beckett. My husband, 41, the man who'd put his hand flat on my back at 2 a.m., looked from his father to me, and back, and said, "Delia, what is this?" I said, "This is the part where I explain that I've never in my life needed you." Camille started to say something about family. She got as far as "we are still" before Harlan put the Attorney General's referral letter in front of her, and she stopped, and she read it, and she looked at her son. "I'll spare you the rest of the legal choreography." 9 million called. The personal guarantee enforced. Ashford and Sons filed for reorganization in February, and the reorganization did what reorganizations do, which is that the name stays on the building, and the family stops owning it. Sterling lost Beacon Hill and the Vineyard House, and more painfully for him, I think, the seat on the hospital board. Beckett pled out in June. Assault and battery, guilty, 2 years probation, a certified batterer's intervention program, and a lifetime of a Google result. The Attorney General's office is not finished with him, and I am told these things take years. Tessa sells handbags on a consignment app now. She posts them with soft lighting on a marble counter that is not her marble counter anymore. I know because a friend sent me a screenshot and I felt, to my own surprise, almost nothing. Camille wrote me a letter in the spring, 4 pages, beautiful handwriting. She wanted me to understand that she had never approved of how they'd all spoken to me and that she had said so, privately, many times. I believe her. That's the horror of it. I believe that she said so, privately, many times, at exactly the volume that costs a woman nothing. The divorce was final in September, a year and a day after the gala. The judge voided the prenup's protections on the strength of the fraudulent transfer. I got my mother's money back with interest, and I got the house in Wellesley, which I sold in 3 weeks to a nice couple with a toddler and a dog. I gave the proceeds to the foundation. I refiled it, alone, under my mother's name. The Josephine Marsh Fund. We bought 61 cellos and violins last year for kids in Dorchester and Roxbury, and I go and I sit in the back at the winter concert and I don't tell anybody who I am. Here is what I know now that I did not know then. The bruise on my cheek was gone in 9 days. I mention it because people say things like it was just a slap, and because I need you to understand that the slap was never the injury. The injury was 11 years of small corrections. The way I learned to laugh more quietly. The way I stopped calling my father on Sundays because Beckett found the calls tedious. The way, standing in that pool house with a garment bag in my hand, my first feeling was relief that I wasn't crazy. That's what he took. The slap was just the receipt. The second thing, everybody who's told me this story back to me makes it about my father. Thank God you had a dad who could ruin them. And I understand why. It's a comforting shape, a rich father coming down out of the sky. But my father didn't ruin anybody. My father sat in a plastic chair, in a hospital hallway for 4.5 hours and asked me one question, and it was the right question, and then he did what I asked and nothing more. Everything else, the ledgers, the copies, the forensic accountant, the lawyer with the dead fern, the standing up in a ballroom with a microphone. I did that. I did that while I was still sleeping next to him. If I hadn't had my father's fund, I still would have had the ledgers. I still would have had Anthony's 41 seconds. I would have had Rosa Guerrero, who testified at the probation hearing on her day off, and who told the court, when they asked her to describe what she'd observed, I observed a room full of people doing nothing. Most women don't have a Callahan partners. Almost every woman has a Rosa. And the third thing, the one I'd tattoo on the inside of my own wrist if I were braver, it wasn't the 600 who laughed, the scabin that made that room dangerous. It was the woman in green who stood halfway up and then sat back down. I'm not angry at her. I was her. I sat back down for 11 years. Beckett texted me on the anniversary of the gala. One line, I hope you're proud of yourself. I read it standing in a school gymnasium in Dorchester, holding a paper cup of lemonade, listening to a 9-year-old named Kiara murder the first 8 bars of a Bach minuet on a cello we bought her. And honestly, the kid was terrible. And her mother was filming with both hands shaking. And I thought about my own mother folding laundry, saying she'd rather be poor and looked at than rich, and passed by. I didn't answer him. I put the phone in my coat and I clapped until my hands stung. If you've ever sat back down when you should have stood up, I'd like to hear about it. Tell me in the comments. And if there's someone in your life whose story you've been quietly not believing, believe her now. Don't wait for the ballroom. Because a room full of people doing nothing is not a room full of monsters. It's just a room full of people who assumed somebody else would move. Be the one who moves.